I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the bright orange envelope tucked into my mailbox on that Tuesday afternoon in October. Nothing good ever came in those envelopes in Riverside Oaks, a gated community just outside of Phoenix, Arizona. My hands were still shaking slightly from the physiotherapy session I had endured that morning, remnants of the injuries that had ended my military career 3 years ago. My German shepherd, Atlas, pressed against my leg as I pulled the envelope free, his warm presence immediately calming the anxiety that spiked through my chest. The letter inside was printed on official Riverside Oaks Homeowners Association letterhead, signed by none other than Patricia Harmon, the HOA president, who had made it her personal mission to enforce every single rule in our community handbook with the enthusiasm of a drill sergeant. I had encountered Patricia exactly twice since moving into my modest 3-bedroom ranch house 6 months ago, and both times she had eyed Atlas with barely concealed suspicion despite the clearly visible service dog vest he wore whenever we went out. "Dear Mr. Nathan Owens," the letter began, and my stomach dropped as I continued reading. "It has come to our attention that you are harboring a pet in violation of Section 8.3 of the Riverside Oaks Community Guidelines, which states that all pets over 30 pounds must be registered with the HOA board and are subject to a monthly pet fee of $50. Additionally, German Shepherds are listed as a restricted breed under Section 8.4 due to insurance liability concerns. You are hereby fined $500 for failure to register your animal and are given 30 days to remove the animal from the premises or face additional fines of $200 per week until compliance is achieved." My vision blurred with rage as I read the words again. Atlas was not a pet. He was my lifeline, my service dog, trained specifically to help me manage the PTSD and physical limitations that had followed me home from Afghanistan. He could sense when I was about to have a panic attack, retrieved items when my back seized up, and provided the emotional support that had literally saved my life on more than one occasion. I crumpled the letter in my fist and looked down at Atlas, who gazed up at me with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. His tail wagged once, a gentle reassurance that we would figure this out together. The next morning, I walked straight to the HOA office, a small building near the community center that always smelled like burnt coffee and disappointment. Atlas walked beside me, his vest clearly displaying the words "Service Dog Do Not Pet" in bold letters. The receptionist, a young woman named Emily who had always been friendly, looked up with genuine sympathy in her eyes. "I need to speak with Patricia Harmon," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "She has office hours on Wednesdays and Fridays," Emily replied, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "But between you and me, you might want to bring documentation. She has been on a warpath lately about the pet policies." I thanked Emily and returned home to gather every piece of paperwork I had regarding Atlas. His certification from the Service Dog Training Program, letters from my VA psychiatrist and my primary care physician, documentation of my disability status, everything that proved Atlas was not just some pet I had decided to keep despite the rules. The Americans with Disabilities Act was clear on this matter, and I had done my research before ever moving into Riverside Oaks. Service dogs were not subject to pet fees or breed restrictions. This was federal law, and it superseded any HOA regulation. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of dry heat that made Phoenix famous. I dressed in a button-down shirt and khakis, wanting to look professional and put together, even though my back was already aching from the effort. Atlas sensed my tension and stayed close as we walked back to the HOA office at precisely 9 in the morning, when Patricia's office hours began. Patricia Harmon was exactly what you would picture when someone said, HOA president on a power trip. She was in her early 50s, with blonde hair cut in a severe bob that framed a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of vague disapproval. She wore a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and her desk was organized with the kind of precision that suggested she measured the distance between her stapler and her pen holder with a ruler. "Mr. Owens," she said as I entered her office, her eyes immediately darting to Atlas with undisguised distaste. "I assume you received our letter." "I did," I replied, setting my folder of documents on her desk. "And I am here to inform you that Atlas is a service dog, protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. He is not subject to your pet policies, fees, or breed restrictions." Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. She opened my folder with 2 fingers as if the papers might contaminate her, and began flipping through them with quick, dismissive glances. "Mr. Owens, I am sure your dog provides you with comfort, but emotional support animals are not the same as service dogs. The HOA has the right to enforce reasonable restrictions." "Atlas is not an emotional support animal," I said, forcing myself to remain calm. "He is a fully trained service dog. The difference is clearly outlined in the ADA. He performs specific tasks related to my disability. The documentation from my doctors explains this." "These letters are quite vague," Patricia said, tapping one manicured finger on my psychiatrist's note. "They mention PTSD and mobility issues, but they do not specify what tasks this animal performs that could not be accomplished through other means." I felt my jaw clench. "Atlas alerts me to panic attacks before they fully manifest, allowing me to take medication and use coping techniques. He retrieves items when my back injuries prevent me from bending or reaching. He provides stability when I am walking on uneven surfaces. He creates personal space in crowded environments when I am experiencing hypervigilance. These are all tasks specifically trained and directly related to my disability." Patricia closed the folder and slid it back across the desk toward me. "Mr. Owens, I am sympathetic to your situation. Truly I am. My uncle served in Vietnam. But the rules exist for everyone's safety and for the preservation of property values in our community. We have had incidents with aggressive dogs in the past, and German Shepherds are specifically listed as a liability concern by our insurance company. The ADA does not allow for breed-specific restrictions on service dogs," I countered, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Federal law supersedes HOA regulations. You cannot fine me for having a service dog, and you cannot force me to remove him from my property." "The HOA board disagrees with your interpretation of the law," Patricia said, her voice taking on a tone that suggested the conversation was over. "The fine stands. You have 30 days to comply or additional fines will be assessed. If you wish to dispute this, you can request a hearing with the full board. Emily can schedule that for you on your way out." I stood up, gathering my documents with shaking hands. Atlas immediately stood as well, pressing against my leg in that way he did when he sensed my distress escalating. "This is illegal, Mrs. Harmon. You are violating federal law." "That is your opinion," she replied, turning her attention to her computer screen in a clear dismissal. "Good day, Mr. Owens." I left the office feeling like I had been punched in the stomach. Emily gave me an apologetic look as I passed her desk, but said nothing. Outside, The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, and I had to stop for a moment to catch my breath. Atlas sat beside me, his presence the only thing keeping me grounded as anger and helplessness warred inside my chest. That afternoon, I called the Department of Justice's ADA information line. The person I spoke with confirmed what I already knew. The HOA was in violation of federal law. They could not charge pet fees for service dogs, could not restrict breeds, and could not require me to remove Atlas from the premises. The representative gave me information about filing a complaint and suggested I might want to consult with an attorney who specialized in disability rights. The problem was that attorneys cost money, and I was living on disability payments and the modest salary from my part-time job doing data entry from home. The idea of getting into a legal battle with the HOA, which had deep pockets funded by everyone's monthly fees, was daunting at best. I decided to request the board hearing, hoping that perhaps the full board would be more reasonable than Patricia alone. Emily scheduled it for 2 weeks out, on a Thursday evening. In the meantime, I received another letter informing me that if I did not pay the initial $500 fine within 30 days, a lien would be placed on my property. The stress was affecting everything. My sleep deteriorated, and the nightmares that Atlas usually helped manage came back with a vengeance. My back pain increased from the tension I carried in my shoulders. I found myself snapping at innocent telemarketers, and nearly had a full-blown panic attack in the grocery store when a child ran past me screaming. Atlas worked overtime, constantly alerting and providing pressure therapy when the anxiety threatened to overwhelm me completely. I started documenting everything. I kept copies of all the letters from the HOA. I wrote down every interaction I had with Patricia or anyone else on the board. I researched similar cases and found dozens of examples where HOAs had been sued and lost for discriminating against people with service dogs. The precedent was clear, but that did not seem to matter to Patricia Harmon and her board. The Thursday of the hearing arrived, and I dressed carefully again, choosing clothes that would make me look respectable and credible. I brought my folder of documentation, now expanded to include printouts of relevant ADA regulations and summaries of court cases. Atlas wore his service vest, freshly cleaned, with all his certification tags attached. The hearing was held in the community center's main room, which smelled like the aftermath of an aerobics class. The board sat at a long table at the front, Patricia in the center, flanked by 4 other board members whose names I had learned were Gregory Mitchell, Susan Palmer, Robert Chen, and Deanne Foster. About a dozen other residents sat in the folding chairs that had been set up, apparently there to watch the proceedings like it was some kind of entertainment. Patricia called the meeting to order with all the formality of a congressional hearing. She read the charges against me, making it sound like I was harboring some dangerous wild animal rather than a highly trained service dog. Then she looked at me with those cold eyes and said, "Mr. Owens, you have requested this hearing to dispute the fines levied against you. You have 10 minutes to make your case." I stood up, my legs unsteady, and Atlas immediately moved to brace against me. "Thank you for hearing me out," I began, my voice sounding stronger than I felt. "I am not disputing that I have a German Shepherd living with me. What I am disputing is the characterization of Atlas as a pet and the application of pet policies to a service dog, which is protected under federal law." I went through my documentation, explaining the difference between emotional support animals, therapy dogs, and service dogs. I cited specific sections of the ADA. I showed them letters from my doctors. I explained in more detail than I was comfortable sharing with strangers, exactly how Atlas helped me function on a daily basis. The Americans with Disabilities Act is very clear, I concluded. Service dogs cannot be restricted based on breed. They cannot be subject to pet fees or deposits. Housing providers, including homeowners associations, cannot require documentation as a condition of allowing a service dog, though I have provided extensive documentation voluntarily. What the HOA is doing is not just against your own governing documents, which must comply with federal and state law, but it is actively discriminatory against someone with a disability. Patricia listened with a blank expression, her hands folded on the table in front of her. When I finished, she looked at the other board members. "Does anyone have questions for Mr. Owens?" Gregory Mitchell, a portly man in his 60s, raised his hand slightly. "Mr. Owens, I appreciate your service to our country, I really do, but we have to think about all the residents here. What happens when everyone claims their pet is a service animal to get around the rules? We have these policies for a reason." "I understand that concern," I replied, trying to keep my frustration in check. "But that is not what is happening here. I have provided extensive medical documentation from VA doctors. Atlas is certified through a recognized service dog training program. The ADA does allow you to ask 2 questions: whether the dog is required because of a disability, and what tasks the dog is trained to perform. I have answered both of those questions thoroughly. You cannot require documentation as a condition of access, but I have provided it anyway to demonstrate the legitimacy of Atlas's status." Susan Palmer, a thin woman with glasses, spoke up next. "But Mr. Owens, we have had problems with German Shepherds in the past. One bit a child about 5 years ago. We have a responsibility to protect the residents." "The ADA does not allow breed restrictions," I repeated, feeling like I was talking to a wall. "The law recognizes that any individual dog might be excluded if it poses a direct threat, but you cannot have blanket breed restrictions. Atlas has never shown aggression to anyone. He is trained to ignore distractions and focus on his work. A service dog that showed aggression would not have been certified in the first place." Robert Chen, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "What about the property values? Some people are afraid of large dogs. If someone is trying to sell their house and potential buyers see a German Shepherd, it could affect their decision." I took a deep breath, counting to 5 before responding. "With respect, Mr. Chen, my right to reasonable accommodation for my disability is not subject to speculation about property values. The Fair Housing Act and the ADA both make this clear. You cannot deny someone housing or access based on assumptions about how other people might react to their disability or their service animal." The discussion went on for another 20 minutes, with various board members raising objections that all boiled down to the same thing. They did not want to make an exception to their pet policy, even though it was not an exception, but a legal requirement. The other residents in the room occasionally murmured or whispered to each other, but no one spoke up in support of me. Finally, Patricia called for the board to deliberate. They huddled together for about 5 minutes, whispering while I stood there with Atlas, feeling like I was on trial for a crime I did not commit. When they broke apart, Patricia's expression was set in stone. "The board has decided to uphold the fine," she announced. "Mr. Owens, we acknowledge that you have provided documentation regarding your dog's training. However, the board maintains that the HOA has the right and responsibility to enforce its pet policies, which were properly adopted and apply to all residents. The fine of $500 stands, and the requirement to either register your dog and pay monthly pet fees or remove the dog from the premises within the original 30-day period remains in effect. If you wish to further dispute this decision, you may pursue other legal channels, but the board's decision is final. I felt like I had been slapped. "This is illegal," I said, my voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "You are violating federal law, and I will not be paying these fines." "That is your choice," Patricia replied coolly. "But failure to pay will result in a lien on your property and potential foreclosure proceedings. This meeting is adjourned." I walked out of that community center feeling more alone than I had since my worst days in the VA hospital. Atlas stayed close, providing the stability I desperately needed as my mind raced through options. I could not afford to lose my house. It was the first place that had felt like home since I came back from Afghanistan. But I also could not give up Atlas, and I sure as hell was not going to pay fines for having the service dog I needed to function. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Atlas snored softly on his bed beside me. Every time I started to drift off, I would jerk awake, my heart pounding, seeing Patricia's cold eyes and hearing her dismissive voice telling me that my disability and my rights did not matter as much as their precious HOA rules. By morning, I had made a decision. I was going to fight this, even if it meant going into debt or spending years in legal battles. What the HOA was doing was wrong, not just for me but for anyone else with a disability who might face similar discrimination. I started searching for disability rights attorneys in the Phoenix area, making a list of phone numbers to call. The first 3 lawyers I contacted either did not take on HOA cases or wanted retainers I could not afford. The fourth, a woman named Jennifer Martinez, listened to my story and then asked me to come in for a consultation. Her office was in a modest building in Tempe, about a 30-minute drive from Riverside Oaks. Jennifer was in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun and the kind of warm smile that immediately put me at ease. She welcomed Atlas into her office without hesitation, even offering him water in a bowl she kept specifically for service dogs. That simple gesture almost made me tear up after the hostility I had faced from the HOA. "Tell me everything," she said, pulling out a legal pad to take notes. I went through the whole story, starting with the first orange envelope and ending with the board hearing. Jennifer asked pointed questions, taking detailed notes and occasionally shaking her head in what looked like a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "This is a clear ADA violation," she said when I finished. "The case law is well established. The HOA cannot charge you pet fees for a service dog, cannot apply breed restrictions, and cannot require you to remove Atlas from your home. The fact that they held a hearing and still upheld the fine after you provided documentation actually makes it worse, because it shows intentional discrimination." "Can we sue them?" I asked, hope flickering in my chest for the first time in weeks. "We can, and I think we should," Jennifer replied. "But I want to be upfront with you about what this involves. We would file a complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development first, and also potentially with the Department of Justice. Those investigations take time, but they are free to you. Simultaneously, we can file a lawsuit in federal court under the Fair Housing Act and the ADA. These cases often settle before trial, especially when the law is this clear, but it could take months or even over a year." "What about the costs?" I asked, the familiar weight of financial worry settling on my shoulders. "I take these cases on a contingency basis," Jennifer said. "That means you do not pay me unless we win or settle. If we win, the court can order the HOA to pay your attorney's fees, which is standard in civil rights cases. You might have some minor costs for filing fees and document copies, but nothing that should break the bank." I felt like I could breathe for the first time since opening that first orange envelope. I want to move forward, I said. Not just for me, but because what they are doing is wrong. No one else should have to go through this. That is exactly the right attitude, Jennifer said, her smile widening. Let me get some paperwork together and we will get started. In the meantime, do not pay the fine and document everything. If they send you more letters, forward them to me. If anyone from the HOA contacts you, make notes of the conversation. We want a complete record of their behavior. Over the next 2 weeks, Jennifer and I worked together to build the case. She had me write out a detailed timeline of every interaction with the HOA. She collected all my documentation regarding Atlas and my disability. She researched the specific HOA bylaws and Arizona state laws regarding homeowners associations. She was thorough in a way that made me feel like I finally had someone in my corner who understood what was at stake. The complaint to HUD was filed first, a thick document that laid out every violation and cited chapter and verse of the relevant laws. A few days later, Jennifer filed the federal lawsuit in the United States District Court for the District of Arizona. The defendants were listed as the Riverside Oaks Homeowners Association, the individual board members in their official capacities, and the management company that the HOA contracted with. The lawsuit asked for several things: a declaratory judgment that the HOA's actions violated the ADA and Fair Housing Act, an injunction preventing them from enforcing the fine or any pet policies against me, compensatory damages for emotional distress and the violation of my civil rights, punitive damages to punish the intentional discrimination, and attorney's fees. When the lawsuit was filed, it became a matter of public record. Jennifer had warned me that it would likely attract media attention, given that cases involving veterans and service dogs tended to resonate with people. She was right. Within a week, I got a call from a reporter at the Arizona Republic who had seen the filing and wanted to do a story. I was nervous about talking to the press, but Jennifer encouraged it. Public pressure can be a powerful tool, she said. HOAs do not like negative publicity. It can motivate them to settle quickly. The reporter, a young guy named Tim Caldwell, came to my house with a photographer. He was respectful and genuinely seemed outraged on my behalf when I told him what had happened. The photographer took pictures of me with Atlas, making sure to capture his service dog Vest clearly. The story ran on the front page of the local section 2 days later, under the headline "Phoenix HOA Fines Disabled Veteran for Service Dog." The response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with calls from friends I had not talked to in years, other veterans who had faced similar issues, and complete strangers offering support. The story was picked up by local TV stations, and I found myself doing interviews in my living room, explaining over and over why service dogs were not pets and why the HOA's actions were illegal. The publicity had an interesting effect on the neighborhood. Suddenly, neighbors who had never said more than a polite hello were stopping me on my walks with Atlas to express their support. A few mentioned that they had always thought Patricia and the board were too aggressive with enforcement, but had been afraid to speak up. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Margaret who lived 3 houses down, even baked me cookies and told me she was praying for me. But not everyone was supportive. I received an anonymous letter, slipped into my mailbox without postage, that called me an entitled veteran trying to get special treatment and accused me of making a big deal out of nothing. Another neighbor, a middle-aged man I had never spoken to, shouted at me from his driveway that I was destroying property values and should just follow the rules like everyone else. The HOA responded to the lawsuit with a motion to dismiss, arguing that they had the right to enforce their pet policies and that I had not properly exhausted my administrative remedies before filing suit. Jennifer had anticipated this and filed a strong opposition brief. The judge scheduled a hearing on the motion for mid-December, about 6 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. In the meantime, the 30-day deadline in the original fine letter came and went. True to their word, the HOA sent me another letter informing me that I was now being fined an additional $200 per week for non-compliance. I forwarded each letter to Jennifer, who added them to our evidence file. The fact that the HOA was continuing to assess fines even after being sued was actually helpful to our case, as it demonstrated ongoing harm and made it harder for them to argue that the matter was moot. The HUD investigation moved more slowly, as those things tend to do. An investigator called me to schedule an interview, which I did over the phone with Jennifer listening in. I went through the entire story again, providing even more detail about how Atlas helped me and why the HOA's actions had affected my daily life. The investigator was professional and took extensive notes, but gave no indication of how long the investigation might take or what the outcome might be. As December approached, the stress began taking a toll again. I was constantly checking my email and mailbox for news from Jennifer or more threatening letters from the HOA. My sleep remained poor despite Atlas's best efforts to help. I found myself having intrusive thoughts about losing my house, about having to give up Atlas, about ending up homeless like so many veterans I had known who could not navigate the systems designed to help them. Jennifer checked in regularly, always patient with my anxious questions, and detailed in her explanations of each step in the legal process. She assured me that the case was strong, that the law was clearly on our side, and that she had seen HOAs back down in similar situations once they realized how much a trial and potential judgment would cost them. The hearing on the motion to dismiss was held in federal court in downtown Phoenix on a Thursday morning. Jennifer had prepared me for what to expect. This was just about legal arguments, not about the facts of the case yet. The judge would decide whether my lawsuit had enough legal basis to proceed, not whether the HOA had actually violated my rights. That would come later if the case was not dismissed. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling and the kind of formal atmosphere that made me nervous despite having done nothing wrong. Jennifer looked completely at ease in her element, her confidence helping to settle my own nerves. The HOA's attorneys were from a large firm in Scottsdale, 2 men in expensive suits who looked like they billed by the minute. Judge Sarah Hernandez entered, and everyone stood. She was a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me a bit of some of the better officers I had served under. She got right down to business, asking the HOA's attorney to present his arguments for dismissal. The attorney, whose name was Richard Lawson, argued that the HOA had simply been enforcing its rules in good faith, that they had given me an opportunity to be heard at the board meeting, and that I should have appealed to some state agency before filing a federal lawsuit. He claimed that service dog cases were complicated, and that the HOA had a reasonable belief that their pet policies could be applied. Jennifer stood to respond, and I could immediately see why she had a reputation as a strong advocate. She methodically dismantled each argument, citing case after case where courts had found HOA pet policies could not be applied to service dogs. She pointed out that there was no requirement to exhaust administrative remedies before filing an ADA claim, and that the HOA's own letters showed they were continuing to assess fines, even after I provided extensive documentation of Atlas's status as a service dog. "Your Honor," Jennifer said, her voice clear and forceful, "this is not a good faith disagreement about a complicated area of law. The ADA has been in effect since 1990, and the rules regarding service animals have been clear for decades. The defendants were provided with extensive documentation showing that Mr. Owens has a disability and that Atlas is a trained service dog who performs specific tasks related to that disability. Despite this, they not only upheld fines but continue to assess additional penalties. This is exactly the kind of intentional discrimination that the Fair Housing Act and ADA were designed to prevent." Judge Hernandez asked pointed questions of both attorneys, and I could tell she was sharp and had done her homework on the relevant law. The hearing lasted about 90 minutes, and then the judge said she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written ruling. "That went well," Jennifer told me as we left the courthouse. "The judge asked good questions, and I think she understands the issues. I would be very surprised if she granted the motion to dismiss." "How long until we know?" I asked. "Could be a few weeks, could be a couple of months," Jennifer replied. "Federal judges have a lot on their plates, but I will let you know the moment I hear anything." The waiting was agonizing. Christmas came and went, a quiet affair for me and Atlas. I video called my sister in Colorado, who had been incredibly supportive throughout this ordeal. She had wanted to fly down to help, but I told her to save her money. This was something I needed to handle, and having her worry would not make it easier. The new year arrived, and with it, more fine letters from the HOA. I was now theoretically in the hole for over $2,000 in various penalties, and the letters were becoming more threatening. The latest one mentioned that the HOA board would be voting on whether to place a lien on my property at their next meeting. Jennifer immediately filed an emergency motion for a preliminary injunction, asking the court to order the HOA to stop assessing fines and threatening liens while the case was pending. This required another hearing, scheduled quickly because of the emergency nature. At this hearing, I actually had to testify. Jennifer prepared me carefully, going over potential questions and reminding me to stay calm and stick to the facts. I took the witness stand with Atlas sitting quietly beside me, his presence the only thing keeping my anxiety from spiraling out of control. Jennifer asked me questions about my military service, my injuries, how Atlas helped me, and what impact the HOA's actions had on my life. I tried to be clear and specific without getting too emotional, though my voice cracked when I talked about the nightmares that had returned and the constant stress of worrying about losing my home. The HOA's attorney cross-examined me, trying to suggest that Atlas was not really necessary and that I was exaggerating my need for him. "Mr. Owens, you seem to be functioning fine right now without your dog doing anything," he said at one point. "He is doing his job right now," I replied. "He is providing calming pressure against my leg because he can sense my anxiety level rising. That is one of the tasks he is trained to perform. Just because it is not dramatic or obvious does not mean it is not happening." The attorney also tried to get me to admit that I had not paid enough attention to the HOA rules when I moved in, implying that this was somehow my fault. Jennifer objected to several questions as irrelevant, and the judge sustained most of her objections. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt drained but also oddly empowered. I had told my truth, and it was now part of the official court record. Whatever happened next, at least I had been heard. Judge Hernandez asked both attorneys to submit proposed orders and said she would rule quickly given the emergency nature of the motion. True to her word, we received the ruling 3 days later. Jennifer called me the moment she saw the order hit the electronic filing system. "Nathan, we won," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. The judge granted the preliminary injunction. The HOA is ordered to stop assessing any fines or fees related to Atlas immediately and is prohibited from taking any action to place a lien on your property while the case is pending. I actually felt tears prick my eyes. "Really? We won." "The preliminary injunction, yes," Jennifer clarified. "The full case still has to be resolved, but this is a huge victory. The judge's order is very strongly worded. She basically says that you are likely to succeed on the merits, that you would suffer irreparable harm without the injunction, and that the public interest favors protecting the rights of people with disabilities. She cites a bunch of case law that supports our position. This is a very good sign for the rest of the case." The judge's written order was 12 pages long, and I read it over and over that evening. Judge Hernandez had rejected every one of the HOA's arguments and had written clearly that service dogs were not pets under the law, that the ADA and Fair Housing Act prohibited the kind of discrimination I had faced, and that the HOA's continuing actions, even after being provided with documentation, suggested a willful disregard for federal law. The order concluded, "Mr. Owens has demonstrated a clear likelihood of success on his claims. The court finds that the HOA's enforcement of pet policies against a documented service dog constitutes discrimination on the basis of disability. The court further finds that allowing the HOA to continue assessing fines and threatening foreclosure would cause irreparable harm to Mr. Owens. Accordingly, the HOA is hereby ordered to immediately cease and desist from any enforcement action related to Mr. Owens's service dog and to rescind all fines previously assessed." I took Atlas for a long walk that evening, enjoying the cool January air and feeling lighter than I had in months. Neighbors who had been following the case stopped to congratulate me. Margaret, the elderly woman who had baked me cookies, actually hugged me and told me she was proud of me for standing up for what was right. But the legal battle was not over. The HOA still had not answered the main complaint, and there was still the question of damages and whether they would be held accountable for what they had done. Jennifer filed a motion to strike the motion to dismiss as moot, since the judge's preliminary injunction ruling had essentially decided the legal questions in our favor, and she pushed for the case to move toward resolution. In early February, Jennifer got a call from the HOA's attorneys asking about settlement. This was expected, she told me. The preliminary injunction had made it clear which way the judge was leaning, and going to trial would be expensive and risky for the HOA. They wanted to talk about resolving the case. The first settlement offer was insulting. The HOA offered to drop all the fines and leave me alone, but with no admission of wrongdoing and no damages. Jennifer did not even bother presenting it to me seriously. "They violated your civil rights and caused you significant distress," she said. "We are not settling for them, just agreeing to follow the law they should have been following all along." The negotiations went back and forth over several weeks. The HOA came up slightly in their offer, suggesting $5,000 to make the case go away. Jennifer countered with a demand for $50,000 in damages, plus attorney's fees, plus a requirement that the HOA implement training for the board and management company about the ADA and Fair Housing Act. What ultimately brought the HOA to the table was the HUD investigation. In late February, HUD issued a preliminary finding that the Riverside Oaks HOA had engaged in discrimination on the basis of disability and was in violation of the Fair Housing Act. HUD gave the HOA an opportunity to respond, but the finding itself was damaging. It could lead to federal penalties and would be public record, further damaging the HOA's reputation. Jennifer used this development as leverage. Your clients are now facing federal findings of discrimination in addition to this lawsuit, she told the HOA's attorneys in a conference call I was allowed to listen to. That is going to affect their insurance, their ability to attract new residents, and their exposure to future claims. Settling this case fairly and implementing real reforms is in everyone's best interest. The HOA's attorneys went back to their clients, and a week later, they returned with a serious offer. $25,000 in compensatory damages, full payment of attorney's fees, a formal written apology, an agreement to implement comprehensive training on disability rights and service animals for all current and future board members and the management company staff. Additionally, the HOA would revise its governing documents to explicitly state that service dogs were exempt from all pet policies. Jennifer and I discussed the offer carefully. Part of me wanted to push for more, to make them pay for every sleepless night and every moment of stress they had caused. But another part of me was exhausted and just wanted it to be over. $25,000 is a reasonable number for a case like this, Jennifer said. It is enough to acknowledge real harm without being so high that they decide to roll the dice at trial. The non-monetary terms are actually very important. The training and policy changes mean this is less likely to happen to someone else, and the written apology, while symbolic, puts them on record admitting they were wrong. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. "I think you have already won the important battles," Jennifer replied. "You get to keep Atlas without any interference. You have been vindicated by both a federal judge and HUD. You will be compensated for what you went through. And you will have forced changes that protect other people with disabilities in your community. That is a pretty complete victory in my book." I agreed to the settlement. The paperwork was drawn up over the next 2 weeks, with attorneys on both sides haggling over specific language. The final settlement agreement was signed in mid-March, almost 6 months after I had received that first orange envelope. The check arrived a week later. $25,000 was more money than I had seen in one place in a long time. Jennifer's fees, which the HOA paid separately, totaled just over $30,000 for the hundreds of hours she had put into the case. I wrote her a long thank you note, trying to express how much her advocacy had meant to me. The written apology came from Patricia Harmon herself, though I suspected it was actually written by the HOA's attorneys. It was formal and somewhat stiff, acknowledging that the HOA had failed to properly accommodate Mr. Owens's service dog as required by federal law, and expressing regret for any distress this may have caused. It was not the groveling apology I might have fantasized about, but it was something. The real satisfaction came a few weeks later, when I received notice that the HOA was holding a special meeting to vote on proposed changes to the community guidelines. I attended, sitting in the same community center where I had been humiliated at the board hearing months before. This time, though, the atmosphere was different. Patricia Harmon was still on the board, though she looked distinctly uncomfortable as she called the meeting to order. The proposed changes to the pet policy were explained, including new language explicitly stating that service dogs were not subject to registration, fees, or breed restrictions, and that the HOA was required to provide reasonable accommodations for residents with disabilities. Several residents spoke during the public comment period. To my surprise, most of them were supportive of the changes. A few had done their own research after seeing the news coverage and understood why the changes were necessary. One older gentleman, a retired lawyer, gave a passionate speech about the importance of following federal law and protecting the rights of disabled residents. There were dissenters, of course. The man who had yelled at me from his driveway stood up and complained that these changes would open the floodgates to people claiming their pets were service animals. Patricia, to her credit, actually shut him down, explaining that the ADA already protected service dogs and that the HOA had been legally required to accommodate them all along. The vote passed overwhelmingly. The new policies would go into effect immediately. After the meeting, several board members approached me. Robert Chen, the one who had asked about property values at my hearing, actually apologized. "I did not understand the law," he admitted. "I should have done more research before voting to uphold those fines. I am sorry you had to go through all this to get us to do what we should have done from the start." It was not much, but it was something. I accepted his apology with a nod. Patricia Harmon did not approach me directly, but as I was leaving, we made eye contact across the room. She looked away first. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine later that she had announced she would not be running for re-election as HOA president when her term ended in June. I did not know if that was related to this case or just coincidence, but I could not say I was sorry to see her go. The mandatory training for the board and management company happened in April. Jennifer recommended a consultant who specialized in fair housing law, and the HOA hired them to conduct a half-day seminar. I was invited to attend, though I was not sure why I would want to spend a Saturday morning watching the people who had discriminated against me get a lecture about why discrimination was wrong. But Emily, the receptionist who had always been kind to me, called and personally asked me to come. "I think it would be powerful for them to hear your story directly," she said. "Not as part of a lawsuit, but as a human being they affected." So I went, with Atlas by my side as always. The trainer, a woman named Dr. Sandra Williams, was excellent. She walked through the history of disability rights law, explained the specific requirements for housing providers, and gave practical examples of how to handle requests for reasonable accommodations. She did not mention my case by name, but everyone in the room knew why they were really there. At the end of the session, Dr. Williams asked if I would be willing to share my perspective. I had not prepared anything, but I stood up and spoke from the heart. "When I came back from Afghanistan, I was broken," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. "I had PTSD, chronic pain, and I honestly did not know if I could function in the civilian world. Atlas saved my life. He is not a pet or a comfort blanket. He is medical equipment, as essential to me as a wheelchair would be to someone who cannot walk. When the HOA fined me for having him, it felt like being told I did not deserve to exist in this community. It felt like all the sacrifices I made serving my country meant nothing." I paused, looking around the room at the board members and staff who were listening intently. I do not think anyone here woke up intending to discriminate against a disabled veteran. But impact matters more than intent. The rules you enforced, the fines you levied, the stress you caused, those were real, regardless of whether you meant them to be harmful. I hope what comes out of this is not just that you follow the law because you have to, but that you actually think about the human beings affected by your decisions. We are not just names on violation letters. We are your neighbors, and we deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. The room was quiet when I sat down. A few people were wiping their eyes. Patricia Harmon stared at her hands, her face unreadable. After the training ended, several people came up to thank me for sharing my story. Susan Palmer, the board member who had asked about the German Shepherd that supposedly bit a child years ago, apologized with tears in her eyes. "I never thought about it from your perspective," she said. "I am so sorry." Life gradually returned to normal after that, or at least to a new normal. I kept working from home, kept going to my physical therapy and VA appointments, and kept walking Atlas around the neighborhood. But things were different now. People knew who I was. Some days that felt good, like I had accomplished something meaningful. Other days it felt heavy, like I was carrying the weight of being a symbol rather than just being myself. The money from the settlement helped tremendously. I was able to pay off some medical bills that had been hanging over my head. I bought a new bed, which helped with my back pain. I even took a weekend trip to Sedona with Atlas, just to get away and breathe air that did not smell like suburban Phoenix. In May, I received notification that HUD had closed its investigation, with a finding that the Riverside Oaks HOA had violated the Fair Housing Act, but that the matter had been resolved through the settlement agreement and policy changes. The finding would remain in HUD's records, but no additional penalties would be assessed. It felt like the final chapter closing on the whole ordeal. June brought new HOA board elections. Patricia Harmon did not run for re-election, as she had indicated. Several new people joined the board, including Margaret, the elderly neighbor who had been so supportive throughout my case. She called to tell me she had decided to run specifically because of what happened to me. "Someone needs to make sure this board remembers its obligations to all residents," she said. One evening in July, almost a year after that first orange envelope had appeared in my mailbox, I was sitting on my small back patio with Atlas at my feet, watching the sun set over the desert landscape. My phone rang, and I saw it was Jennifer Martinez. "I just wanted to check in and see how you are doing," she said when I answered. "I know the case has been over for a few months, but I like to follow up with clients." "I am doing okay," I told her. "Better than okay, actually. The nightmares are less frequent. I am sleeping better. I even started volunteering with a local veterans group, helping other vets navigate the VA system." "That is wonderful," Jennifer said warmly. "You know, your case actually had ripples beyond just your HOA. I have gotten calls from several other attorneys asking about the details because they have similar cases. And I have seen at least 2 other HOAs in the Phoenix area revise their service dog policies proactively. What you did made a difference for a lot of people." After we hung up, I sat there thinking about her words. I had not set out to be an activist or to change policy. I had just wanted to live in my house with my service dog without being harassed. But by standing up for my rights, by refusing to back down even when it was scary and uncertain, I had accomplished something bigger than myself. Atlas shifted, pressing his head against my knee in that way he did when he sensed I was getting emotional. I scratched behind his ears, grateful beyond words for this animal who had saved me in so many ways. The irony was not lost on me that the HOA had tried to take away the very thing that gave me the strength to fight them. The stars were coming out, visible even through the light pollution of suburban Phoenix. I thought about all the veterans who were struggling, dealing with disabilities visible and invisible, trying to navigate a world that often did not understand or accommodate their needs. I thought about all the times I had felt alone in that struggle, but I was not alone. There were laws that protected people like me, lawyers like Jennifer who fought for those rights, and communities of people who understood and supported each other. The system did not always work quickly or easily, but it could work if you were willing to stand up and use it. A few weeks later, I got a letter from a veteran in Tucson who had read about my case online. He was facing a similar situation with his condo association and his service dog. He asked if I would be willing to talk to him about my experience and how I had handled it. I called him that evening, and we talked for over an hour. I shared everything I had learned, gave him Jennifer's contact information, and encouraged him to document everything and not give up. That conversation led to others. Word spread through veteran networks that I was someone who had successfully fought an HOA and was willing to help others. I started getting calls and emails regularly from veterans dealing with housing discrimination, not just about service dogs, but about other disability accommodations as well. I was not a lawyer and could not give legal advice, but I could share my story and connect people with resources. By August, I had helped connect 4 other veterans with disability rights attorneys. 2 of those cases were already resolved through quick settlements, with the HOAs backing down as soon as they received demand letters citing my case and others like it. Knowledge was power, and the more people knew their rights, the harder it was for organizations to violate them. In September, I was invited to speak at a veterans event in Phoenix about disability rights and housing. Standing in front of a room full of veterans and their families, with Atlas sitting calmly beside me, I told my story one more time. But this time, I focused not on what had been done to me, but on what I had learned and how others could protect themselves. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a powerful tool, I told the audience. But it only works if we use it, if we speak up when our rights are violated, if we document everything and seek help from people who know how to navigate the system. It is scary to fight back, especially when you are dealing with PTSD or anxiety or depression on top of everything else. But you are not alone in that fight. There are advocates, there are laws, and there is a whole community of people who have been through similar battles and will stand with you. The applause when I finished was overwhelming. Afterward, dozens of people came up to thank me, to share their own stories, to ask questions. I exchanged contact information with several of them, promising to help however I could. One young woman, probably in her mid-20s, waited until almost everyone else had left before approaching me. She had a psychiatric service dog, a golden retriever, and was facing resistance from her landlord, who wanted to charge her a pet deposit. She was crying as she told me her story, clearly at the end of her rope. "I do not know if I can fight this," she said. "I do not have money for a lawyer, and I am already dealing with so much." I gave her Jennifer's information and explained about contingency fees and HUD complaints. But then I did something else. I gave her my phone number. "Call me if you need to talk," I said. "If you need someone who understands, fighting for your rights is worth it, but it is not something you have to do alone." As I drove home that evening, I thought about how much my life had changed in the past year. I had gone from someone just trying to survive day to day with his disabilities to someone who was actively helping others navigate similar challenges. The fight with the HOA had been awful while I was in it, but it had also given me a sense of purpose I had been lacking since leaving the military. Atlas was curled up on his bed that night, snoring softly, when I sat down at my computer and started typing. I created a simple website with information about service dog rights, links to relevant laws and resources, and contact information for disability rights organizations and attorneys. I included my own story, with photos of the letters from the HOA and copies of the court orders that had vindicated me. I figured if just one person found the site and it helped them understand their rights, it would be worth the effort. The website went live in October. Within a month, I was getting emails from all over the country. People with service dogs, people with other disabilities facing housing discrimination, advocates and attorneys asking if they could share the information. The site was simple and basic, but it was filling a need. By the end of the year, I had helped over 20 people facing housing discrimination related to service animals. Some cases resolved quickly with demand letters. Others required filing complaints or lawsuits. But every single person I helped went from feeling powerless to understanding that they had rights and options. That was worth more than any settlement check. In December, I received an unexpected call from the Arizona Department of Veterans Services. They wanted to give me an award for my advocacy work on behalf of disabled veterans. The ceremony was held at the state capitol in January, exactly 1 year after Judge Hernandez had issued the preliminary injunction in my case. Standing in the Capitol rotunda, receiving a plaque and shaking hands with state officials felt surreal. I was just a guy who had fought back when his rights were violated, but apparently that was enough to make a difference. The director of the Department of Veterans Services, a retired Army colonel, spoke at the ceremony about the importance of veterans standing up for each other. Nathan Owens could have paid the fine and gotten rid of his service dog to avoid conflict, she said. Many people would have chosen that path of least resistance, but Nathan understood that backing down would not just hurt him. It would set a precedent that made it easier for other disabled veterans to be discriminated against. By fighting back, he protected not just himself but countless others. My sister flew in from Colorado for the ceremony, and seeing her proud face in the audience made me emotional. After everything I had been through, after all the darkness of PTSD and chronic pain and feeling like I did not belong anywhere, I had found a way to turn that struggle into something meaningful. In the spring, Margaret called to invite me to an HOA board meeting. The board wanted to present me with a formal commendation for my advocacy work and to thank me for helping improve the community's policies. I was skeptical about attending, given my history with the HOA, but Margaret assured me it would be different. The community center was full when I arrived, with many more residents than normally attended board meetings. The new HOA president, a friendly man named Thomas who had always been kind to me, opened the meeting and then asked me to come forward. "Mr. Owens, on behalf of the Riverside Oaks Homeowners Association, I want to apologize for the way you were treated," Thomas said. "The previous board's actions were wrong, both legally and morally, but your response to that wrong has made our community better. Because of you, we now have policies that protect all residents with disabilities. Because of you, our board members are trained on their legal obligations. Because of you, Riverside Oaks is a more inclusive and welcoming place." He handed me a framed resolution that formally apologized for the discrimination I had faced and commended me for my advocacy. Several residents gave me a standing ovation. I noticed that Patricia Harmon was in the audience, sitting in the back. She did not applaud, but she did nod at me when I looked her way. It was the closest to an acknowledgement I would probably ever get from her. That night, sitting on my patio with Atlas, I reflected on the journey of the past 18 months. It had started with discrimination and fines, with feeling powerless and alone. It had involved stress and legal battles and public exposure I had never wanted. But it had ended with vindication, with policy changes, with helping others, and with finding a purpose that made my daily struggles feel worthwhile. Atlas looked up at me with those wise brown eyes, and I swear he understood everything. He had been with me through the worst of it, providing the support I needed to keep fighting. He was more than a service dog. He was my partner, my protector, and my friend. "We did good, buddy," I told him, scratching behind his ears. "We really did good. The future still had challenges. My PTSD would not magically disappear, and my back would probably always hurt. There would be bad days and setbacks and moments when the darkness crept back in. but I had proven to myself that I could fight back when necessary, that I could stand up for what was right even when it was hard, and that I did not have to face those challenges alone. Other veterans continued to reach out, and I continued to help where I could. The website grew, with more resources and information. Jennifer and I stayed in touch, and she referred several clients to me for peer support while she handled their legal cases. The network of advocates and attorneys and veterans helping veterans expanded and strengthened. In early summer, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to do a short film about service dog rights, using my case as the central story. I was hesitant about the publicity, but Jennifer encouraged me to participate. The more people understand these issues, the less likely it is to happen to someone else, she said. The filming took place over several weeks, with the crew following me around as I did daily activities with Atlas, interviewed me about my experiences, and talked to Jennifer and some of the other veterans I had helped. The director was respectful and focused on the legal and advocacy aspects, rather than trying to make it overly dramatic or emotional. The documentary premiered at a Veterans Film Festival in Los Angeles in September. I flew out with my sister and Jennifer, and we watched it in a theater full of veterans and advocates. Seeing my story on a big screen was strange and uncomfortable, but the response was powerful. The film won an award and went on to be screened at film festivals and veterans events around the country. It even got picked up by a streaming service, reaching an audience I never could have imagined. The increased visibility led to more opportunities to speak and advocate. I was invited to consult with several HOAs that wanted to proactively improve their disability policies. I spoke at law schools about the practical impact of disability rights laws. I testified before the Arizona State Legislature about proposed legislation to strengthen protections for service dog handlers. Through all of it, Atlas remained my constant companion. He was getting older now, almost 8 years old, and I was already dreading the day when he would retire and I would need to work with a new service dog. But that was a worry for the future. For now, he was still healthy and doing his job with the same dedication he had always shown. One afternoon in late autumn, I was working at my computer when I received an email that made me stop and read it 3 times. It was from the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. They were compiling information about barriers that people with disabilities faced in housing, and they wanted to interview me about my experiences with the HOA as part of their research. The information would be used to develop better enforcement guidance and potentially new regulations. I called Jennifer immediately. "Is this real? Did I just get asked to help the Department of Justice develop policy?" She laughed. "That is exactly what that email is saying. Nathan, your case has become one of the examples that advocates cite when they talk about HOA discrimination. Of course, the DOJ wants to hear from you." I did the interview a few weeks later, speaking with 2 DOJ attorneys for over an hour about every detail of my case. They asked thoughtful questions about what had been most challenging, what had been most helpful, and what changes to law or policy might prevent similar situations. It was intimidating, but also validating to have the federal government taking my experience seriously. As the 2nd anniversary of receiving that first orange envelope approached, I found myself in a place I never could have imagined back when this all started. I had gone from being a disabled veteran, just trying to live quietly with his service dog, to being a recognized advocate for disability rights. I had helped dozens of people fight back against discrimination. I had influenced policy at the state and potentially federal level. And I had proven to myself that my life had purpose and meaning beyond just surviving, On the exact 2-year anniversary, I took Atlas for a walk around Riverside Oaks. We passed houses where I now knew many of the residents by name. Margaret waved from her garden. A young couple with a toddler stopped to say hello and let their child pet Atlas with my permission. The neighborhood that had once felt hostile now felt like home. When we got back to my house, there was an envelope in the mailbox. For a split second, my heart clenched, remembering those orange envelopes from the HOA. But this one was white, and when I opened it, I found a thank you card from one of the veterans I had helped 6 months earlier. His case had been resolved, his service dog was safe, and he wanted me to know how much my support had meant to him. I added the card to a box I kept in my office, full of similar messages from people I had helped along the way. On days when the PTSD was bad or the pain was overwhelming, or I questioned whether any of this advocacy work mattered, I would pull out that box and read through the cards and letters. They reminded me why I had fought back, and why I kept fighting. That evening, I updated my website with new information about recent court cases and policy developments. I answered emails from 3 people asking for advice about their situations. I scheduled a speaking engagement at a veterans center in Flagstaff for the following month. And then I closed my laptop and spent the rest of the night just being present with Atlas, grateful for everything we had been through and everything we had accomplished together. The fight with the Riverside Oaks HOA had been one of the hardest things I had ever done, harder in some ways than combat, because it was a different kind of battle with different kinds of weapons. But it had also transformed my life in ways I was still discovering. It had given me purpose, connected me with an incredible community of advocates and fellow veterans, and taught me that standing up for what is right, even when it is terrifying, is always worth it. Atlas dozed on his bed, his paws twitching as he dreamed. I looked at him and thought about how different my life would be without him, not just because of the practical tasks he performed, but because of the courage he had given me to fight for my rights. The HOA had tried to take him away, had fined me and threatened me and made my life hell for having him. But in the end, we had won. Not just a legal victory, but something deeper and more lasting. The laws protecting people with disabilities and their service animals had been there all along, passed by previous generations of advocates who had fought their own battles. By enforcing those laws, by refusing to be intimidated or silenced, I had honored their legacy and strengthened protections for future generations. That was something no HOA fine or threatening letter could ever take away. As I got ready for bed that night, I thought about all the veterans and people with disabilities who were out there right now, facing discrimination and not knowing they had rights or how to enforce them. I thought about the HOAs and landlords and businesses that continued to violate the law, counting on people being too intimidated or exhausted to fight back. And I renewed my commitment to keep speaking up, keep educating, keep helping others find the strength to stand up for themselves. The journey that had started with an orange envelope and an unjust fine had led me to become an advocate, an educator, and a voice for others who might not be able to speak up for themselves. It was not the path I had planned when I moved to Riverside Oaks, but it was the path I was meant to walk. And I would keep walking it, with Atlas by my side, for as long as I was able, because that is what you do when you have been through hell and made it to the other side. You reach back and help pull others through. You shine a light in the darkness so others can find their way. You fight not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. And you never, ever give up, because the moment you give up, you give power back to those who would discriminate and oppress and violate the rights that so many have fought to protect. The HOA had tried to fine me for having a service dog. They had tried to force me to choose between my home and my health. They had discriminated against a disabled veteran and thought they could get away with it. But they had been wrong. Federal law had protected me. A dedicated attorney had fought for me, and I had found the courage to stand up for myself and others. That courage had changed everything. It had changed Riverside Oaks' policies. It had changed how other HOAs in Arizona approached service dog cases. It had changed the lives of the dozens of people I had helped. And it had changed me, giving me purpose and direction when I had been lost. As I drifted off to sleep that night with Atlas's gentle snoring in the background, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time: peace. Not the absence of challenges or pain or struggle, but the deeper peace that comes from knowing you have fought for something that matters, that you have made a difference, and that your life has meaning beyond just your own survival. The battle with the Riverside Oaks HOA was over. But the work of advocacy and education and helping others would continue. Because that is what this had always been about, from the moment I received that first unjust fine. It was about standing up not just for my rights, but for the rights of everyone who might face similar discrimination. It was about making sure that the laws protecting people with disabilities were not just words on paper but lived realities that made a difference in people's lives. And in that mission, that purpose, I had finally found my place in the world after leaving the military. Not as a soldier anymore, but as an advocate. Not fighting with weapons, but fighting with words and knowledge and the law. Still serving, still protecting, still making a difference. Just in a different way, with a different uniform, and with the best battle buddy anyone could ask for sleeping peacefully by my side.